The dust swirled, a gritty ochre haze that clung to everything in Bamenda. It was 2019, the heart of the Anglophone crisis, and the city was a raw wound, bleeding disgust and fear. Etangana, his uniform stained with sweat and the ever-present red dust, leaned against his patrol vehicle, the worn leather of his holster digging into his hip. He watched as a military convoy rumbled past, the soldiers' faces grim, their eyes scanning the narrow, winding streets. He was a ghost in the system, a flicker of decency in a landscape of corruption. Bribery was a commonplace, justice a commodity for the wealthy, and the lines between law enforcement and those they were supposed to protect had blurred into a sickening, indistinguishable mess. Etangana, however, refused to bend. He had seen too much, the fear in the eyes of the innocent civilians, the casual brutality of those who were supposed to uphold the law. His colleagues called him Saint Etangana, a mocking title that hid a silver of grudging respect. They knew he couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated. He was a stubborn weed in their carefully cultivated garden of graft. Etangana had witnessed the devastating toll of the crisis as innocent lives were lost, including those of the civilians who were simply caught in the crossfire. The corrupt system seemed to operate with impunity, consuming both the guilty and the innocent without distinction. But Etangana knew that often the crisis itself was not the primary issue. It was the law enforcement officers who were supposed to maintain order, but instead became a force of terror, perpetuating the problem. Etangana had seen it all and knew the truth. In a world where the police were supposed to be guardians for peace and protectors of the innocent, the reality in Bamenda was starkly different. The police had become an enemy, a force to be feared and avoided. The bullied and intimidated civilians taking out their frustration and personal demons on the very people they were sworn to serve. It was as if the weight of their own problems, the curses, the troubles that came with the job was crushing them, and they were taking it out on anyone who crossed their path. For some, like Afu, a towering and muscular officer with a booming voice, the troubles began at home. His beautiful but intimidating wife held the reins, controlling every aspect of his life and telling him what to do and what not to do. Afu seethed with anger and resentment, but he dared not show it. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, fearful of losing the woman he loved. So, he took out his frustration on the streets of Bamenda, pouring his anger and aggression onto the young men who roamed the rascalic streets. It didn't matter if they were law-abiding citizens or not. Afu saw them all as targets, as outlets for his own pent-out rage. For many, the frustration and anger simmered just below the surface, fueled by the injustices of a system that seemed to design to exploit and to oppress. Their meager salaries, already barely enough to make ends meet, were further depleted by the crippling taxes that devoured a significant chunk of their hard-earned income. It was a bitter irony that the very government they swore to defend was the same entity that seemed determined to squeeze every last penny from their pockets. The added insults of having to furnish their own offices with basic necessities like tables and chairs, a responsibility that should have fallen squarely on the government's shoulders, only served to further inflame their resentment. The indignity was compounded by the fact that the police officers were expected to fuel their own military vehicles, a cost that should have been covered by the department's budget, but the money allocated by the government seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving the officers to foot the bills themselves. New recruits, fresh-faced idealistics were particularly vulnerable to the system's cruelties. They were often the ones who suffered the most, forced to bear the brunt of the corruption and the inefficiency that plagued the government. As a result, the officers took out their frustration on the civilians, patrolling the streets with a sense of entitlement and hostility. They pinned problems on anyone who crossed their path, using their power to extort money from the very people they were supposed to protect. The civilians, already struggling to eke out a living in a harsh and unforgiving environment, were forced to pay the price for the officers' discontent. They paid with their sweat, their blood, and their hard-earned cash, victims of a system that seemed designed to exploit and oppress. One sweltering afternoon, a woman named Mama Efua approached Officer Etangana, her face etched with worry. Her son, a young student named Nji, had been arrested during a sweep, accused of being an Amba boy, a separatist fighter. She insisted he was innocent, that he had been at the market buying groceries. Efua's desperate plea echoed the countless orders Etangana had heard. He knew the system. G would be beaten, held, and likely disappear into the labyrinth of the military detention system. It was a common cruel fate. He told Efua he would look into it, a promise he knew was dangerous. He visited the detention center, a grim concrete structure that exuded a stench of fear and disinfectant. The officer in charge, a man named Captain Ngwa, was notorious for his brutality. Ngwa scoffed at Etangana's inquiries. Another Amba sympathizer. Ngwa snarled, his eyes hard. You go dey learn for the mind your own business dem eh. Na waiting for the dig into my own criminal where I catch am. He said angrily. Etangana didn't back down. He knew Ngwa was involved in a lucrative extortion racket, using the crisis as a cover. He had heard whispers, seen expensive cars, and the newly built houses. He knew Ngwa wouldn't want scrutiny. I have a statement from the witness who saw Nji at the market, Ngwa said, his voice low and steady. I also have information regarding certain financial discrepancies within this facility. Ngwa's face darkened. He knew Etangana wasn't bluffing. You're playing a dangerous game, Etangana, he hissed. Ngwa was worse than the other cops, a man who had mastered the art of compromise and corruption. Unlike his colleagues, who wore their fatigue and desperation like a badge of honor, Ngwa exerted an air of confidence and prosperity. His well-tailored uniform, immaculately pressed and adorned with gleaming badges, seemed to shimmer with an aura of power and influence. But the truth behind Ngwa's polished facade was far more sinister. He had long since abandoned any pretense of integrity, selling his soul to the highest bidder in exchange for a slice of the lucrative pie. His connection to the upper echelons of government were well known, and he had become a trusted fixer, a man who could be relied upon to take care of the dirty businesses that others didn't want to touch. Ngwa's services were in high demand, and he was handsomely rewarded for his efforts. He had become a master of the dark arts, a man who knew exactly which button to press and which levers to pull in order to get what he wanted. And what he wanted above all else was power and wealth. Ngwa was no longer just a corrupt cop. He was a ruthless, cunning operator, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. And Etangana, by taking those first tentative steps down the road off to a case Ngwa thought he had under control of slicing off every penny from the victim's family, had unknowingly placed himself in a grave danger. Etangana ignored the threat. He knew he was walking on a tightrope, but he couldn't let Nji disappear. He needed proof. He spent the next few days gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and meticulously documenting Ngwa's activities. He found records of inflated supply orders, phantom detainees, and payments from terrified families. He knew he couldn't go through official channels. The system was rotten. He needed to find a way to expose Ngwa without getting himself killed. He reached out to a journalist, a woman named Anya, who had risked her life to report on the crisis. He gave her the evidence, trusting her to expose the truth. Anya, known for her tenacity and fearlessness, was at the verge of publishing the story to expose Ngwa's corruption and the plight of Nji. The tension in Bamenda was a palpable thing, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear and suspicion. Ngwa had eyes and ears everywhere, informants who whispered in the shadows. He had always been paranoid, a trait that had served him well in his corrupt dealings. One of his informants, a low-level clerk at the local telegraph office, intercepted a coded message Anya had sent to her editor. The message, though cryptic, contained enough keywords to alert Ngwa to her impending expose. He knew Anya was the source of the leak, the one who had dared to shine a light on his darkness. He acted swiftly and brutally. He couldn't afford to let her story reach the outside world. He dispatched his remaining loyalists, men who owed him their livelihood and their freedom, to silence her. They found Anya in her small, cluttered apartment, the glow of her laptop illuminating her determined face. The details of her death were brutal and swift, a stark reminder of the power Ngwa still wielded. When Etangana found Anya's body, the scene was a chilling tableau of violence. The message was clear: silence those who dare to speak. The city held its breath. The death of Anya, however, didn't deter Etangana. It fueled his resolve. He knew Ngwa had crossed a line that had been crossed many times. But this time, it felt different. This was a direct challenge, a declaration of war. He knew he was now a marked man, but he couldn't back down since Ngwa would figure out those details obviously came from him. He began to walk in the shadows, utilizing the very networks Ngwa had relied on, but for a different purpose. He reached out to Anya's contacts, the ones she had trusted, the ones who shared her commitment to truth. He found the clerk who had intercepted Anya's message and, with promises of protection and a carefully constructed story, persuaded him to provide the original message and its source. He found people who had seen Ngwa's men entering Anya's apartment, people who had been too afraid to speak before. He carefully documented the chain of command, tracing the orders back to Ngwa. He found evidence of Ngwa's continued control over his network, his ability to manipulate events from behind the scene. He knew he couldn't trust the local authorities, so he sought out a federal prosecutor, a woman known for her integrity, who was investigating corruption within the security forces. He presented her with his evidence, a meticulously compiled dossier that implicated Ngwa in Anya's murder and his continued criminal activities. The prosecutor, shocked by the extent of the corruption, acted quickly. She obtained a warrant for Ngwa's arrest for murder. She also secured warrants for his loyalists, those who had carried out his orders. The arrest of Ngwa was a public spectacle. It was a clear message: no one was above the law, not even those who thought they were. This time, there was no room for doubt, no possibility of escape. The city once again held its breath, but this time, it was a breath of anticipation. Etangana, standing amidst the chaos, knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he had struck a blow against the darkness, a blow that would resonate through the streets of Bamenda, a testament to the power of one man's unwavering commitment to justice. The fallout was swift and chaotic. Ngwa now behind bars, his racket exposed. G was released, his body bearing the marks of his ordeal, but his spirit unbroken. The city burst with a mixture of fear and hope. Etangana knew his life was in danger, especially with the high elevated personalities in the government. But he also knew he had made a difference. He had shown that even in the darkest of times, a single act of courage could ignite a spark of hope. He continued his work, a silent guardian in a city teetering on the edge. He knew he couldn't change the entire system, but he could make a difference, one life at a time. He was a Tangana, the good cop, a beacon in the dusk, and for the people of Bamenda, that was enough.
Please subscribe to watch more of our videos. Thank you.